The first thing I heard was not the bulldozer. It was a tree cracking behind my house where no one had permission to touch it. At 7:10 that Monday morning, I was standing at my kitchen counter pouring coffee when the sound rolled through the back windows, deep and sharp enough to make me set the mug down. Then came the diesel rumble. I stepped onto the back porch and smelled fresh-cut wood before I understood what I was seeing. Beyond the lawn, where 11 acres of hardwoods had screened my house from Stonebridge Hills for years, a yellow machine was pushing through churned red soil. Sunlight poured into spaces that had been shaded the day before. Orange ribbons fluttered from trunks farther down the slope, and fresh stumps showed pale against the dark ground. I am Ethan Walker. I was 44 then, a consulting civil engineer, and I had owned that property in North Carolina for 8 years. I knew exactly where my backyard ended, exactly where the woods began, and, more importantly, exactly where Stonebridge Hills did not. I pulled on my work boots, grabbed my phone and the survey tube from my office, and headed outside. I did not walk toward the machinery. I stayed well outside the work area and waved until a man in a reflective vest noticed me. He signaled to the operator, and a minute later the engine dropped to an idle. The sudden quiet made the damage look even worse. A woman stepped from beside a white sport utility vehicle parked near the access path. Diane Whitmore, 56, president of the Stonebridge Hills Homeowners Association, carried a clipboard against her cream blazer like she had arrived for an inspection. "Ethan," she said, sounding more inconvenienced than surprised, "you cannot interrupt an authorized project." I looked past her at the exposed dirt. Authorized by whom? The association. This is the community firebreak and drainage corridor. I unrolled my survey across the hood of my pickup. This is not community property. Diane barely glanced at it. Our records identify this as the rear buffer. A buffer is not the same thing as HOA-owned land. The contractor approached and introduced himself as Greg Lawson. I asked him one question. "What boundary map were you given?" Diane answered before he could. "The approved project map." I looked down at the muddy tire tracks crossing the slope, then toward a white oak that had stood there since long before Stonebridge Hills existed. It was gone. So were dozens of trees around it. I walked along the safe edge of the clearing until something metallic caught the morning light near a fresh stump. I crouched and brushed loose soil away with my fingers. There it was, an old iron survey pin, exactly where my closing survey said it would be. The bulldozer tracks continued well past it onto my side. I stood up and looked at Diane. She still had that clipboard tucked against her arm. "You should call your attorney," I said. Her expression hardened. "Over some trees?" I looked across the torn open woods and smelled oak sap hanging in the warm air. I had no idea yet how many were gone. But I knew something Diane did not. Those trees had records, measurements, locations, and history, and by the time we finished counting them, the property line was going to be the least expensive part of her problem. 8 years earlier, the woods behind my house were the reason I bought the place. The house itself was nothing extravagant, a 2-story brick home outside Raleigh with a detached workshop and a long gravel driveway. But behind it sat 11 acres of hardwoods that made the property feel 100 miles farther from town than it really was. The first afternoon I walked those woods, sunlight came through the oak canopy in narrow gold strips, and the only sounds were leaves moving overhead and water running through a shallow drainage swale near the eastern edge. Stonebridge Hills was already there beyond the trees, neat roofs, trimmed lawns, and identical black mailboxes, but from my back porch I could barely see any of it. I wanted to keep it that way. My work as a consulting civil engineer had taught me never to trust a fence, a mowing line, or somebody saying a boundary was approximately over there. Before closing, I paid for a boundary survey. The surveyor located the iron pins, marked the corners, and handed me a map showing exactly how the 11 acres wrapped behind the house. I walked the property with that survey folded in my hand until I could recognize every turn of the line without looking at the paper. Near the rear boundary stood a mature white oak beside one of the iron pins. Its trunk was wide enough that I could not comfortably reach around it. Years later, when I had an arborist inspect several trees near the house after a windstorm, that oak appeared on his inventory as tree 137. I remembered the number because I took a photograph of it that afternoon, the little numbered tag visible on the trunk and the iron pin sticking out of the leaves beside it. I saved the photograph with the inspection report and forgot about both. Back then, there was no reason to think they would ever matter. The woods were not decorative landscaping. Their roots held the slope behind my house. Their canopies shaded the property through North Carolina summers, and the thickest section formed a natural screen between my home and Stonebridge Hills. I maintained trails, cleared fallen limbs, and removed hazardous trees when professionals recommended it, but I never wanted the land stripped clean. That difference became important when Diane Whitmore first contacted me about what she called a community improvement. Stonebridge wanted better drainage access along the rear of several homes, and the route they preferred crossed part of my wooded acreage. Diane arrived one Saturday morning carrying a folder and talking about efficiency, maintenance vehicles, and a cleaner buffer. She showed me a preliminary map with a broad colored strip running through the trees. I studied it for less than a minute before shaking my head. That route crosses my property. Diane smiled as if I had misunderstood something simple. It follows the community buffer. I went inside, brought out my recorded survey, and placed it beside her map. The community may benefit from the buffer, I told her, but that does not mean the community owns it. She looked toward the woods, then back at the survey. We can discuss an easement. You can ask, I said, and I can say no. At the time, I thought that was the end of it. I did not know Diane would remember that conversation very differently. The easement request did not disappear after that Saturday. 3 days later, Diane emailed me a revised proposal showing the same corridor shifted maybe 15 feet north, still crossing my property. She described it as necessary for drainage maintenance and emergency access behind the Stonebridge homes. I understood the engineering argument. What I did not understand was why every solution seemed to require land the association did not own. I marked the recorded boundary on her PDF, attached the survey again, and replied that I was not granting an easement along either alignment. Diane answered before lunch. Our records show this area as a community buffer maintained for the benefit of Stonebridge Hills. I read that sentence twice. Then I wrote back. A privately owned buffer does not become common property because neighboring homes benefit from it. I attached the survey for the second time. After that, nothing. No phone calls. No revised proposal. No attorney letter. For almost 2 months, the woods returned to being just woods. I worked, mowed the clearing around the house, repaired a drainage inlet near my driveway, and spent one Saturday removing a fallen pine from a trail. Once, while walking the rear line, I noticed fresh orange ribbon tied to a sapling near Stonebridge. I assumed a utility crew had been marking something on their side. I took a photograph anyway. That habit came from 20 years of engineering work. If something near a boundary changes, document it before somebody changes it again. A week later, I noticed 2 more ribbons. Then small wooden stakes appeared farther down the slope. None matched my survey markers. I emailed Diane asking whether Stonebridge was conducting field work near my property. Her response came that evening. The association is proceeding with approved vegetation management within the community buffer. I called her the next morning. Does that vegetation management cross my deeded boundary? Our contractor has the approved project map. That is not what I asked. She paused. The association is comfortable with its records. I looked through my office window toward the tree line. I have sent you my recorded survey twice, and we have our own documentation. Then have a surveyor reconcile them before anyone clears anything. Her voice cooled. Ethan, we cannot stop every community project because one neighboring owner disagrees with an old map. My survey is 8 years old. The iron pins are older than Stonebridge. She ended the conversation by saying the board had already approved the work. That afternoon, I printed the entire email chain and put it in the same file cabinet as my closing documents. I also found the old arborist report from the windstorm inspection. Most of the inventory meant nothing to me then. Species, trunk diameter, condition ratings, numbered locations. I flipped through it until I saw tree 137, the mature white oak near the rear boundary. Attached behind the report was the photograph I had taken years earlier. The oak filled most of the frame. At its base, half hidden beneath brown leaves, was the iron survey pin. I almost smiled at how ordinary the picture looked. Then I filed it away again. 6 weeks later, on that Monday morning, I was standing beside a fresh stump with that same iron pin exposed in the mud. Greg Lawson finally unfolded the project map his crew had been given and placed it beside my survey on the hood of my pickup. He studied one, then the other. His face changed before he said a word. "Mr. Walker, he said quietly. These boundary lines are not in the same place. Diane stepped closer. Greg, follow the approved plan. He looked at her, then back at the iron pin beyond the bulldozer tracks. Not until somebody tells me which plan is legally right. Then he raised his radio and stopped the entire crew. The moment Greg shut the crew down, the whole clearing changed. A few seconds earlier it had been engines, warning beeps, and equipment moving through dirt. Now there was only the low tick of cooling machinery and the smell of diesel mixed with fresh oak. Diane stared at Greg as if he had forgotten who hired him. You have an approved work order, she said. Greg folded his map once and kept it in his hand. I have an approved work order based on a boundary map that does not match the recorded survey this property owner just showed me. Until that gets resolved, my equipment stays parked. Diane turned toward me. Ethan, this is unnecessary. I looked past her at the clearing. No, what happened before I came outside was unnecessary. I took photographs from outside the work zone first, starting with the iron pin, then the tire tracks beyond it, then the stumps. I made sure each image showed enough surrounding ground to establish location. Greg did not interfere. In fact, once he understood what I was documenting, he told his crew not to disturb anything else. Then he gave me the name of his company and confirmed that Stonebridge Hills had supplied the project map. I wrote down the time. 8:12 in the morning. Diane stood near her white sport utility vehicle making phone calls while I followed the safe perimeter of the disturbed area. At first, I tried counting stumps in my head. 23, 38, 51. Then the numbers became meaningless. Some trees had been cut close to the ground. Others had been pushed out during grading, leaving exposed root areas and fresh soil. I switched to photographs and voice notes, marking approximate locations against my survey instead of guessing. By 10 o'clock, Greg had sent me a digital copy of the map his company received. The problem jumped off the page. Stonebridge's project line treated a broad strip behind the subdivision as though the HOA controlled it. My recorded boundary cut directly through that strip. I called Rachel Monroe, a real property attorney I had worked with on an access dispute for an engineering client several years earlier. I gave her the short version. She stopped me when I started estimating the number of trees. Do not estimate damages yet, she said. Preserve evidence, preserve communications, and get the boundary professionally verified. Before noon, I had a licensed surveyor scheduled for the next morning. Greg agreed to leave the disputed area untouched. Diane finally walked back toward me with her phone in one hand. Our attorney believes this can be handled as a landscaping issue, she said. We can replace trees. I looked at the open slope behind her. The privacy screen that had taken decades to grow was now full of sunlight. You do not know what needs replacing yet. She gave me a tight smile. They are trees, Ethan. They can be replanted. That sentence stayed with me. By late afternoon, I had walked the entire affected strip without entering any unsafe equipment area. Using photographs, stump locations, disturbed root zones, and the old inventory as a starting reference, I reached a preliminary count near 200 affected trees. I still did not know what that meant financially, and Rachel had warned me not to invent a number. What I didn't know was that the HOA had treated the woods like one disposable patch of green. The next person I called was Thomas Bennett, the consulting arborist whose old report was sitting in my filing cabinet. When I told him what happened, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Ethan, do not count this as one clearing. I looked across the rows of pale stumps. What should I count? Thomas answered, every tree. Thomas Bennett arrived just after 8 the next morning, 10 minutes behind the licensed survey crew Rachel had recommended. He stepped out of an old gray pickup wearing work boots, khaki pants, and a faded field vest with a diameter tape clipped to one pocket. He did not start by looking at my photographs or asking what I thought the damage was worth. He walked to the edge of the clearing and stood there silently. Morning light reached places that had been dark under canopy for decades. This was closed woodland yesterday, he asked. Until Monday morning. Thomas nodded and opened his field notebook. The surveyors began locating the existing iron monuments while he moved from stump to stump, recording species where identification remained possible, trunk diameter, condition indicators, location, and surrounding site function. Oaks, hickories, maples, pines. Some were smaller understory trees. Others had trunks wide enough that Thomas needed several steps to move around them. I followed at a distance, taking photographs when he asked, After an hour, I finally asked the question Diane seemed to think had an easy answer. How much does a tree cost? Thomas stopped beside a broad oak stump and looked at me. That is the wrong question. He tapped the edge of the stump with his pencil. A young oak at a nursery has a retail price. A mature tree established on a property is evaluated differently. Species matters. Size matters. Condition matters. Location matters. What the tree was doing for the site matters. And whatever method applies has to be defensible. He pointed toward the exposed slope. You also lost screening. There may be restoration issues. There may be erosion concerns. Those are separate questions. That was when I understood why Rachel had warned me not to throw out a dramatic number. This was not 200 trees multiplied by some convenient price from a garden center. Every affected tree had to be documented before anyone could responsibly discuss damages or restoration. By late morning, the survey crew had confirmed what my closing survey already showed. The iron monuments matched my recorded boundary. The disturbed corridor crossed onto my property and continued inside it for a substantial distance. I emailed Rachel the preliminary confirmation immediately. She replied with 4 words, "Preserve everything from here." Greg had already provided his work order, project map, and the contact information for his company's insurer. He also confirmed in writing that Stonebridge Hills supplied the boundary information his crew used. Diane sent me nothing. Around noon, Thomas asked whether I still had his old tree inventory. I brought the report from my office, along with the photographs attached to it. He began matching old entries against surviving landmarks. Then his finger stopped halfway down one page. Tree 137, he said. I recognized the number immediately. We walked toward the rear line, following the surveyor's fresh flagging until we reached the iron pin I had uncovered the morning before. Beside it was the massive white oak stump. Thomas measured it, checked his old notes, then held up the photograph from 8 years earlier. There was the same oak, alive and spreading across the frame. At its base was the same iron pin. The relationship between them was unmistakable. Thomas looked from the photograph to the stump, then toward the equipment tracks extending farther into my acreage. Keep this picture somewhere safe, he said. Why this one? I asked. He handed it back to me. Because anyone can argue about a line drawn on the wrong map. It is much harder to argue with a tree that spent decades standing beside the actual boundary marker. By Wednesday morning, Tree 137 had become the one piece of evidence nobody could explain away. The survey crew finished its field work shortly after 9 and sent Rachel a preliminary boundary sketch before lunch. Every recovered iron monument aligned with my recorded survey. Stonebridge's project map did not. The clearing had crossed the rear boundary and continued across my land in a broad, uneven strip, exactly where Diane had been told months earlier that the association needed an easement. Thomas spent the morning building what he called a defensible inventory. We did not call every damaged trunk a valuable mature tree just because that sounded better. Some were smaller. Some had defects. Some were common species. Others had provided substantial screening or occupied important positions along the slope. Thomas measured what could still be measured and compared stump locations against his old inventory, photographs, surviving trees, and the survey. By early afternoon, our documented count reached 200 affected trees. I stood beside his truck looking at pages of numbers and asked, "So this is the final count?" "It is the count we can support," he said. That distinction mattered. Rachel called 20 minutes later. She had received another document from Greg Lawson, the original work package Stonebridge had provided his company. It included the vegetation management authorization, the project map, and instructions identifying the disputed strip as part of the community buffer. Greg's crew had not invented the boundary. They had followed the line they were given. That moves the question upstream, Rachel told me. Now we need to know who approved that map and what they knew when they approved it. I already knew one thing Diane had received. My survey. Twice. I forwarded Rachel the entire email chain, including Diane's statement that the association was comfortable with its records and my written request that a surveyor reconcile the boundaries before clearing began. Rachel was quiet while she read. Then she asked, "Did she ever send you a survey supporting their position?" "No, a deed. No, an easement." "No. Then keep every message exactly as it is." That afternoon, Thomas and I returned to Tree 137. The stump sat only a few feet from the exposed iron pin, pale wood surrounded by red dirt and equipment tracks. I held the old photograph beside the scene. 8 years separated the two images, but the landmarks lined up almost perfectly. The oak, the pin, the slope, even a crooked hickory farther downhill was still visible in both. Thomas added the comparison to his file. By then, Stonebridge's attorney had contacted Rachel, and the tone was different from Diane's talk about replacing a few trees. They wanted copies of the survey, the preliminary arborist documentation, and Greg's work records. Rachel provided what was appropriate and requested preservation of the HOA's emails, project files, maps, board approvals, contractor communications, and insurance information. Just before 5, another email arrived. Stonebridge had scheduled an emergency board meeting for Friday evening. Diane would be there. So would the association's attorney. Rachel asked me to attend, but told me not to argue numbers that Thomas had not finalized. Bring the survey, she said. Bring the old photograph. Bring the email chain. Let their own documents do the rest. I looked through my office window at the opening where the woods had been. For the first time since Monday, I understood what this fight was really becoming. Diane had treated the clearing as one project. Greg had treated it as one work order. But Thomas had documented 200 separate trees, and Rachel was about to put every piece of the decision that removed them back into chronological order. Friday evening, I walked into the Stonebridge clubhouse carrying one folder. Rachel carried another. Diane was already seated at the head of the conference table with the association's attorney on her right and Martin Cole, the board treasurer, on her left. 3 other board members sat along the polished table. Nobody looked comfortable. Diane did not offer the confident smile she had worn beside the bulldozer Monday morning. "We are here to resolve a misunderstanding," she said. Rachel placed her folder on the table. "Then the documents should make this meeting fairly straightforward. The association's attorney asked us to begin with the boundary." I unfolded my recorded survey. Rachel placed the survey crew's new field verification beside it. The recovered iron monuments matched. Then she added Stonebridge's contractor map. Even from several feet away, the difference was obvious. Martin leaned forward. "Which map did the contractor use?" Greg Lawson had provided a written statement, and Rachel read the relevant sentence aloud. His company had performed work according to boundary information supplied by Stonebridge Hills. Diane folded her hands. That map came from association records. Was it prepared by a licensed surveyor? Rachel asked. Diane looked toward the association's attorney. He answered carefully, "We have not established that." Rachel opened the next document. It was my email from 2 months earlier with my recorded survey attached. Mr. Walker provided this before the project began. Martin turned toward Diane. "You had his survey?" "I had a document he represented as his survey." "It is recorded," I said. Rachel touched my arm lightly, reminding me to let the paper do the talking. She moved to the photographs. First came the image of tree 137 from 8 years earlier, the mature white oak beside the iron boundary pin. Then came Wednesday's photograph of the same location, the same pin, the same slope, the same crooked hickory farther downhill, and a wide stump where the oak had stood. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Rachel placed Thomas Bennett's preliminary inventory on the table. Page after page documented species, measurements where recoverable, locations, site functions, and supporting evidence. Martin flipped through the report. "How many?" 200 affected trees supported by the current documentation, Rachel said. Diane leaned back. "We have already said landscaping can be restored." Rachel looked directly at her. "This is not a quote for 200 nursery trees. Restoration, site impacts, individual tree evaluation, screening loss, and other applicable damages require professional analysis. Mr. Walker is not assigning an unsupported number tonight." That answer seemed to bother Diane more than a dramatic demand would have. There was no figure for her to dismiss. Only evidence accumulating 1 page at a time. Then Martin asked the question that changed the room. "Before we authorized clearing, did anyone verify Ethan's survey against ours?" Diane said the contractor had been given the approved map. "That is not what I asked," Martin replied. The association's attorney opened a separate file. "There is another issue the board needs to review." He removed a printed email. It had been sent internally 11 days before the clearing. The message recommended independent boundary verification before work proceeded because a neighboring owner had supplied a conflicting recorded survey. Diane's expression went completely still. Martin stared at the page. "Who received this?" The attorney did not answer immediately. He turned the document toward the board. Diane's name was on the distribution line. I remembered standing beside the bulldozer while she told me the association was comfortable with its records. Now the room knew something I had not known that morning. Stonebridge had not simply missed the boundary dispute. Someone had warned them to verify it before the first machine ever touched my trees. For the first time all week, Diane had nothing ready to say. Martin Cole read the internal email twice, then slid it toward the other board members. The message was dated 11 days before the clearing and specifically recommended an independent boundary survey because I had provided a recorded survey that conflicted with Stonebridge's project map. Diane, Martin said, "Did you receive this before the board authorized the contractor to proceed?" She looked toward the association's attorney. "I received dozens of messages about projects." "That is not an answer." The attorney stepped in before the room turned into an argument. "The board should focus on establishing the record." Rachel nodded. "Agreed." She opened the email chain I had preserved. My first response showed the recorded survey attached. My second response showed it attached again. Then came my request that Stonebridge reconcile the boundary before anyone cleared vegetation. Finally, there was Diane's written statement that the association was comfortable with its records. Rachel placed those pages beside the internal warning. The dates lined up in a way no explanation could soften. Stonebridge had been told there was a boundary conflict. Stonebridge had been advised internally to verify it. The work had proceeded anyway. Martin removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. What did the board actually approve? The secretary pulled up the meeting minutes on her laptop. The recorded motion authorized vegetation management within the association-controlled rear buffer. Rachel pointed to those words. Association-controlled. The motion did not authorize entry onto Mr. Walker's property. The room went quiet again. Diane finally spoke. "The map presented to us showed the corridor inside the buffer." "Who prepared that map?" Martin asked. Nobody answered. The attorney searched through the project file and found a PDF with no surveyor's seal, no certification, and no indication that a licensed professional had established the property boundary. It appeared to be a planning exhibit created for the maintenance project. Somehow, that exhibit had become the field map Greg's crew relied on. Diane tried one last time. The purpose was legitimate. We needed drainage access. I looked at her across the table. "That is why you asked me for an easement." Her face tightened. Rachel immediately placed Diane's original easement proposal beside the project map. The proposed corridor and the cleared corridor overlapped through the same section of my woods. Martin stared at both documents. "So we asked permission to use this land. Ethan refused. And then we later treated the same land as ours." Diane shook her head. "That is not what happened." "Then what happened?" Martin asked. She did not answer. The association's attorney requested a private session with the board. Rachel and I stepped outside onto the clubhouse porch. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass, and somewhere beyond the parking lot sprinklers clicked across a lawn. 20 minutes later, we were invited back inside. Diane was no longer sitting at the head of the table. Martin was. He spoke carefully. "Effective immediately, all work involving the disputed corridor is suspended. The association will notify its insurer, preserve the complete project record, and obtain independent legal and surveying review. Diane will have no further authority over this matter while that review is pending." Diane stared at the closed folder in front of her. Nobody celebrated. I certainly did not. 200 trees were still gone. But as Rachel gathered our documents, Martin stopped us. "There is one more thing." He turned his laptop toward the table. The association's accounting records showed that the clearing had not been planned only for drainage maintenance. A second project was scheduled behind it, a widened service route connecting to a proposed community pavilion site. The trees on my land had been standing directly in the cheapest path to reach it. The pavilion project explained why Diane had been so determined to treat my woods as a community buffer, but it did not change what happened next. Over the following weeks, the arguments moved away from the clubhouse and into the slower world of survey reports, insurance files, arborist documentation, legal correspondence, and restoration estimates. That was exactly where Rachel wanted them. Thomas completed his report without pretending every tree had identical value. Each documented tree was evaluated according to what could actually be supported: species, size, condition, location, prior records, and its function on the property. The report also addressed the loss of screening and the practical difficulty of restoring a mature wooded buffer with young replacement trees. A separate assessment examined the disturbed slope and the work needed to stabilize exposed areas before erosion created another problem. Stonebridge's insurer sent its own professionals. Greg's insurer reviewed the contractor records. Nobody disputed the most important fact anymore. The clearing had crossed my recorded boundary. Greg's company had worked from the map Stonebridge provided, and Stonebridge had received both my survey and an internal warning before authorizing the work to proceed. The pavilion access plan made the timeline even harder for the association to explain because the route they wanted closely followed the easement I had refused months earlier. There was no dramatic courtroom moment and no magical check delivered overnight. There were meetings, revised reports, negotiations, and weeks when almost nothing seemed to happen. Then the pieces finally settled. The association accepted responsibility for funding an agreed restoration program and resolving the documented property damage claim through its insurer. The plan included slope stabilization, native replacement trees selected for the site, screening restoration, professional monitoring, and clearly marked protection around the surviving woodland. The proposed service route to the pavilion was redesigned completely away from my property. Stonebridge also adopted a rule requiring professional boundary verification before future projects could approach privately owned land. Diane did not remain in charge of those decisions. The board removed her authority over property access projects during the investigation, and before the next annual meeting, she stepped down as president. I never needed an apology from her. I needed the line behind my house to mean something again. Months later, a survey crew returned and installed visible boundary markers along the rear acreage. Restoration crews worked carefully this time, planting native species where Thomas recommended and repairing the exposed slope. The new trees looked impossibly small against the open sky. I knew I would never see them become what the old woods had been during the years I had left, and that was the one thing no settlement could truly replace. Tree 137 remained different. We left part of its stump in place beside the iron pin, and Thomas helped me preserve a small cross-section from it. I mounted that piece of oak in my workshop beneath a copy of the old photograph. In the picture, the tree stood tall beside the same boundary marker that eventually proved exactly where Stonebridge's authority ended. Sometimes I would look at the growth rings and think about Diane's words that first morning. They are trees, Ethan. They can be replanted. She had looked across my property and seen one obstacle standing in the way of a project. Thomas saw 200 individual trees. Rachel saw a chain of evidence. Greg saw a map he should never have been given. And I saw the land I had paid for and protected for 8 years. Diane thought she had cleared a strip of woods. What she actually created were 200 separate reminders that authority does not become ownership simply because somebody prints it on a map.